Okay, demography is not a very popular concentration or specialty within sociology. So, I don't know if you know what is demography. And this is what we mean by demography. It is essentially the study of populations. And it focuses on how the different components of population they change to affect population change or population growth as a whole. The three main components of demography would be fertility, mortality, and migration. So, it's a no-brainer. Population change can come through increase in fertility. You can read the definitions for fertility, mortality, and migration from your ebook. And population can also change in the short run or in the long run through changes in mortality rates. And we all know it remains to be seen with coronavirus how the population is going to change in a given country or in a given location like a city or a town. And population can also change through the process of migration. Research has been done by one of my colleagues at Penn State. His research found that older adults they may prefer to migrate to places that have more amenities for older adults. Or it's a no-brainer. It has been long confirmed by researchers that sometimes the elderly they migrate to warmer places during the winter months and they may move back to their original place, sometimes in the north, in summer. So, migration can also lead to changes in the population in a given location. And your book also mentions what is population composition. Essentially, population composition describes the changes in these three components of demography. And your book also talks about sex ratio. It is just the number of men for every 100 women. Let's see if we can find the formula for sex ratio. Yeah, here is the formula for sex ratio. It's just the number of men to every women. And sometimes they go by 100. And sometimes it just say how many men to a woman in a given location. So, sometimes, as you can see from here, sex ratio, they don't go by every 100. Sometimes they are being shown this way. How many men to a woman? Sometimes they disaggregate their data by age group. And as we can see from this webpage or from Wikipedia essentially, countries that tend to be more patriarchal have slightly higher sex ratio for younger ages. And maybe because women tends to outlive men, so sex ratio decline at older ages, as we can see from here. And sometimes they lump all the ages together and they have a sex ratio for all these age groups combined. So as we can see from here, countries that are more patriarchal have higher sex ratio. Look at this, some of the African countries. They have slightly more men than women. Look at China. And some countries in Latin America. They have slightly more men than women. And look at India. And Kosovo or Kuwait, the sex ratio is really high. So, this implies that sometimes maybe gender-based inequalities may play into a country's sex ratio. So this is what we mean by sex ratio. Are we clear? And your book also mentioned population pyramid. It's just a graphical depiction of how population in a given country, in a given city, or in a given state are distributed by age and by sex. This is what we mean by a population pyramid. On one side, it shows the male population. On the other half, it shows the number of percentages of female populations in different age groups. This is what we mean by population pyramid. And this is a population pyramid from Cuba in the 50s. And this is another population pyramid from China, also in the 50s. Let's check out Nebraska if we find anything. Let's see. Okay, here we have the number of Hispanic population in different age groups. So this is a population pyramid for Hispanics in Nebraska in the 90s. This is all. So as you can see, this population pyramid in the 90s for Hispanics, they look somewhat like a small triangle, like what we saw for Cuba is a bigger triangle here. And for China is also a bigger triangle for these countries in the 50s. So this can imply that the Hispanic population were growing. There were more young people for the younger age groups, for both men and women, and it declined as people progressed through age. Okay, this is a population pyramid for Nebraska almost or 20 years ago. And this pyramid looks different from the one we saw for Hispanics or the one we saw for Cuba and China in the 50s. And we have a somewhat larger percentages of men and women in the middle age groups and a somewhat larger people between 15 to 19. late teenage years. So this tells us that population in Nebraska may somewhat decline. There are a few people who are in their infanthood or childhood years or early adolescence years. And there are somewhat larger number of teenagers here and somewhat larger numbers of middle-aged groups here. So this implies that population aging began to take place 20 years ago in Nebraska. Okay, so sometimes okay, let's go to this website for a while. So this is an interactive website and you can always pick a country and it will show you the population pyramid. So in the 50s in Cuba, it was a young and growing population. But as we move from the 50s, it's going to move by itself. Can you see that? As we move from the 50s to sometime in the future, it says that the Cuban population is aging. Now there are more people in their middle age range and is expected to have more elderly population as years go by. So in the 2010s, there are more middle-aged population for both sexes, and this middle-aged population is going to move to another age range in 10 years from 2010 to 2020. So this year it says that the Cuban population has begun to age. The middle-aged population from here has moved to here as they progress through age over time. So this is what an aging population pyramid looks like. They don't look like a triangle. And sometimes the politicians or policy makers, they do make use of population pyramid and other demographic characteristics, other types of census data to make decisions. For instance, Hitler referred to the census to figure out how many people there were in different racial ethnic groups in the 1920s or 1930s during the Nazi Germany era. And because of that, as we can see, this action later became a policy, affected many people in Germany. Maybe because of that, many young people were being drafted to become Nazis, military personnel. sometimes is against their will. We cannot find population in Germany before the 50s. But as we can see, population aging has even begun in Germany in the 50s. So Hitler referred to the census to figure out how many people were Jews, how many people were Germans, how many people were there from different age groups. And maybe because of that, some people were being made obligated to join the Nazis, and some people had to go to camps. So policy makers did refer to demographic data when they want to make any kinds of decisions, even to this day. And with coronavirus, it has been tabulated that more elderly are affected by the virus, and because they have weaker immune systems, they are more vulnerable to the virus. So even to this day, policy makers continue to make decisions based on demography data. And let's go back to Cuba in the 50s. It was a young population, right? And we all know sometimes young people, they tend to be more idealistic and maybe impressionistic. And because of that, maybe some of them bought into Fidel Castro's ideologies and they supported his revolution. Maybe the same thing could be said for China. And I Googled, I could not find the population pyramid for China before the 50s. So in the 50s, the Chinese population was growing. This could be part of the reason why the one-child policy was implemented in the late 70s until they took it off recently. Now I think there is a two-child policy because of population aging in China. And this is because the Chinese population was growing from the 50s. Even until the 80s. And maybe partly because of that, they implemented the one-child policy. And we begin to see population aging in here. We can see there are more mid-aged adults here, and in years to come they are going to progress to these age groups and these age groups. And now the Chinese population pyramid ceased to look like a triangle. Population aging has occurred in China in this day and time. We can also see population aging in China in 2015 and maybe 2010. We can say that in 2010, population aging is bound to happen in China. And in your assignment, you have to go to this website or just Google, see what you find. Let's say you want to work in Kansas. It still brings you to this census website. Or you can go to another website if you plan to work in Kansas after graduation. So you just look at the number of percentages of people in different age groups in Kansas and just try to gauge whether this is a growing or aging population. And just briefly talk about the racial ethnic composition in Kansas or in the city, the state where you want to work. And you can mention just anything from here you like. The average family size or household size, number of people living alone. So let's say you plan to be in the healthcare field, and if you want to work in cancers, is this a good idea or a bad idea? You can gauge from here. This may not be a bad idea because urgent cares, they may do quite well in cancers. There's a moderately high percentages of adults population from 25 to maybe people in their early 50s in cancers. And sometimes these people may go to urgent cares for their immediate needs. And there's also a somewhat high percentages of married couples family or family with kids, and sometimes kids or even teenagers, sometimes they play sports, we know. And when people play sports, they are bound to be mishaps. So sometimes parents may take their kids to urgent cares if they had a mishap by playing sports. So if you plan to be in the healthcare profession, and it seems that it's not a bad idea to go to cancers from the data we saw. So this is what I want you to get at for this assignment. Are we clear? And if you plan to work in another country, you can just Google population characteristics of, let's say, Japan, and see what you found. And just try to write something in 150 words or so to talk about the demographic characteristics of Japan and whether it's a good idea to work in Japan in a few years' times. So I think you know how to do your assignments, right? If not, I'm just an email away. Stay safe.